The room was warm with soft lighting and polite applause. The kind of applause people give when they want to be seen as supportive without committing to anything. Crystal glasses clinked. Someone laughed a little too loudly. I stood slightly behind my husband. Close enough to be included. Far enough to be forgettable. He hadn't told me he was going to speak. When he reached for the microphone, I assumed it was another harmless remark. Something charming. Something that reinforced the image everyone loved. He smiled first. That familiar, easy smile that had carried him through boardrooms, dinners, and decades of never being questioned. "She's just overreacting," he said, tilting his head toward me as if I were a minor inconvenience. "Everyone gets it. You know how emotional she can be." The words landed lightly, like a joke. A safe joke. The kind that didn't sound cruel unless you were the one standing there. A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the crowd. Not loud. Not cruel. Just enough to signal agreement. A woman near the front glanced at me, then quickly looked away. A man nodded, as if this explanation restored balance. No one said a word in my defense. No one needed to. The moment had already been decided. I felt my ears ring, but my heartbeat stayed steady. That surprised me. I waited for the familiar rush of heat, the instinct to explain myself, to fix the discomfort. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, chilling calm. I didn't react. I didn't smile. I didn't leave. I stayed silent all night. And somewhere between that sentence and the applause that followed, I understood that this wasn't humiliation. This was exposure. And I knew, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that his perfect life had just reached its ending. The evening continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Conversations resumed. Music softened the edges. Someone touched my arm and said, "He didn't mean it like that," as though intention mattered more than impact. I nodded, because that was easier than correcting them. On the drive home, my husband hummed along to the radio. He seemed relaxed, satisfied even. He talked about how well the event had gone, how important it was to keep things light in public, how people appreciated honesty. "You know I was kidding," he said, not looking at me. "You're too sensitive sometimes." I watched the streetlights pass, evenly spaced. Predictable. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain how small I had felt standing there while strangers laughed politely at my expense. I had learned, years ago, that explanations only gave him more material. Outwardly, our life looked balanced. People said we complemented each other. He was confident, decisive, admired. I was supportive, calm, the emotional one who softened his edges. Friends often told me how lucky I was, how not everyone found a man who could lead so effortlessly. What they didn't see was how carefully that image had been built, how often I smoothed over his sharpness, reframed his dismissiveness, absorbed the impact so others wouldn't have to. What they called stability was really just silence, practiced and perfected at home. He poured himself a drink and loosened his tie. The night, to him, was over. Whatever discomfort lingered belonged to me alone. He assumed I would do what I always did, retreat inward, recover quietly, and let time erase the moment. He didn't notice the shift. I moved through the house the way I always had, measured and calm. I put my things away. I washed my hands at the sink, watching the water run clear. The reflection in the mirror looked the same, but something underneath had changed. Not anger, not sadness, awareness. For years, he had corrected me in subtle ways. A comment here, a joke there, always framed as humor, logic, reason. If I objected, I was told I was reading too much into it. If I stayed quiet, it was taken as agreement. Over time, everyone learned the same lesson. His version of events was the safest one to believe. That night, I realized how much effort it took to keep that version intact. Lying in bed beside him, listening to his breathing even out, I thought about how confident he was in his control, how certain he was that the room would always laugh with him, not at him. How sure he was that I would never be the variable he needed to worry about. He slept well. I didn't cry. I didn't replay the moment in my head looking for ways to fix it. I didn't plan a confrontation or imagine an apology that would never come. Instead, I noticed something far more important. I noticed how dependent his certainty was on my silence. In the days that followed, life continued with impressive efficiency. Messages were returned. Invitations arrived. People treated us exactly the same. On the surface, nothing had changed. That was the most revealing part. I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I listened more than I spoke. I paid attention to what unsettled him, what he guarded too carefully, what he assumed I had forgotten. He believed the incident was behind us. He believed my silence meant submission, embarrassment, acceptance. He mistook stillness for surrender. What he didn't understand was that silence can also be preparation. Standing in that room, under soft lights and polite laughter, he thought he was reminding everyone who held the power. In reality, he showed me exactly where his life was most fragile. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The days after the event slid back into place with unsettling ease. Like a rug smoothed over a stain no one wanted to acknowledge. My husband acted as if the night had never happened. He joked at breakfast. He answered emails with his usual confidence. He moved through our home as though nothing had shifted beneath his feet. That, more than the words he'd spoken, told me everything. On the second morning, he asked if I wanted coffee. The question was casual, almost generous. When I nodded, he smiled, relieved. Normalcy restored, or so he believed. He talked about his schedule, a meeting later in the week, people who needed his time. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't need to. In his mind, the story had already been written, out in the world. We were still the same couple. Friends greeted us warmly. Messages came in about how wonderful the event had been, how poised he looked, how charming his remarks were. One woman sent me a note saying she admired how well I handled things, as if restraint were a compliment and not a survival skill. People had always seen our marriage as balanced. He was decisive and respected. I was understanding and adaptable. When disagreements happened, they were framed as differences in temperament, never as power. He was logical. I was emotional. That contrast explained everything and excused anything. I had helped build that narrative. Piece by piece, I smoothed over his sharper moments. I laughed when a correction stung. I learned which topics to drop and which opinions to soften. In public, I made sure his confidence never wavered. In private, I told myself this was what partnership looked like. Over time, those small accommodations hardened into expectation. Money was one of his favorite tools, not because he controlled it outright, but because he controlled the conversation around it. Decisions were presented as practical, inevitable. When I questioned them, he reminded me how stressful his responsibilities were, how emotional interference only complicated things. It sounded reasonable. It always did. Socially, he curated our circle with the same precision. There were conversations I wasn't included in, introductions made without me, decisions already settled before I arrived. If I noticed, he explained it away. If I pressed, he reassured me. The message was consistent. Trust him, and everything would run smoothly. That morning, as he left for work, he paused at the door. "You're quiet," he said lightly. "Don't hold on to things. It's not healthy." I smiled and told him I was fine. The truth was, I had never felt clearer. As the week unfolded, I began to notice something I had overlooked for years. For all his confidence, there were certain areas he guarded obsessively, certain names that made him stiffen, certain messages he read twice before responding. His life looked effortless, but it depended on careful maintenance. One afternoon, while he was on a call, I watched him pace the living room. His voice was calm, reassuring. When he hung up, he checked his phone again, then again, as if waiting for something that didn't arrive. He noticed me watching and smiled too quickly. Just work, he said. I believed him. And yet, I didn't. It wasn't that he was doing something new. It was that I was seeing the structure for the first time. His authority rested on people believing a single version of him. Competent. Trustworthy. Unquestioned. As long as that image held, everything else aligned. I realized then how much effort it took to keep that alignment intact. I changed my behavior in small ways that were almost invisible. I stopped offering reassurance when he seemed tense. I stopped filling silences. I listened. I observed. When he explained things, I let him talk without interrupting. The more agreeable I became, the more he relaxed. He mistook my quiet for compliance. He had always done that. At dinner one night, he mentioned someone I hadn't heard him talk about in years. He spoke casually, but his eyes flicked up to gauge my reaction. I gave him none. I nodded and asked an unrelated question. The relief that crossed his face was brief, but unmistakable. That was when I understood how dependent he was on my predictability. I thought back to moments I had dismissed as insignificant, times when I had stepped in quietly, smoothed something over, made a call he didn't know about. At the time, I believed I was protecting us. I told myself loyalty meant absorbing risk so he wouldn't have to. What I hadn't realized was that I had been holding the weight of more than just our marriage. One evening, he said, "I'm glad you didn't make a big deal out of the other night." He said it kindly, as if praising maturity. People respect discretion. I looked at him and saw how certain he was that the matter was closed, that my silence had sealed it. He had no idea that discretion cuts both ways. That night, lying awake while he slept beside me, I stopped asking myself whether I was being unfair. I stopped wondering if I should have spoken up sooner, louder, differently. Those questions belonged to the version of me who still believed understanding would change things. This version of me was done explaining. I knew now that the life he treasured wasn't as solid as it appeared. It relied on alignment, on timing, on people staying in their assigned roles. And for the first time, I stepped out of mine. He believed my silence meant the lie would hold. What he didn't know was that the lie was no longer protecting him. It was protecting me. By the third day, the shock had fully drained out of my body, leaving something colder and far more useful in its place. The house moved on its usual schedule. Mornings came, evenings passed. From the outside, nothing about our life suggested disruption. That illusion had always been his greatest asset. Inside me, something had gone permanently still. I stopped checking his mood before I spoke. I stopped measuring my tone. When he was distant, I let him be. When he was talkative, I listened without feeding the performance. The space that opened up felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room that had always been locked from the inside. I understood now why I had learned silence so early. Every time I had defended myself in the past, it had become evidence against me. Emotion was labeled instability. Hurt was reframed as weakness. Anger, proof that I couldn't be trusted with the truth. Silence, on the other hand, gave him nothing to reshape. What people called passivity had been restraint. What he mistook for fear had always been calculation. I just hadn't named it that way before. A few days later, I ran into Daniel Mercer at a small cafe near my office. We hadn't seen each other in years. He was someone from my husband's past, though not close enough to be part of our carefully managed present. We exchanged pleasantries, the kind that don't mean anything until they suddenly do. "Still married?" he asked, smiling politely. I nodded. He hesitated, then said, almost casually, "Your husband always did land on his feet." The phrasing caught my attention. Not successful. Not impressive. Landed on his feet. Daniel stirred his coffee and went on, unaware that he had shifted something in me. I always wondered how he managed to walk away from certain situations without a scratch. Not many people could have done that. I asked him what he meant, keeping my voice even. He waved it off. Old stuff. Doesn't matter now. But it did. The way he said it told me everything. There were stories I had never been meant to hear. Not because they weren't true, but because they had been buried efficiently. My husband's confidence wasn't built on innocence. It was built on timing, leverage, and other people stepping in at the right moment. Like I had... The memory came back to me later that night, uninvited and sharp. Years ago, there had been an incident, a situation that could have ended very differently if certain details had surfaced at the wrong time. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out, my husband pacing behind me, angry and afraid in equal measure. He had asked me to make a call, just one call, to smooth things over, to redirect attention. I had done it without hesitation. I told myself it was loyalty. That marriage meant shielding each other. I never mentioned it again, and neither did he. The situation disappeared, and with it, the risk, until now, lying in bed. I saw that moment clearly for the first time. I hadn't just protected him. I had absorbed the consequences he couldn't afford. In doing so, I had unknowingly taken on leverage, not because I planned to use it, but because silence creates weight. The next day, I watched him more closely. The way his jaw tightened when certain names appeared on his phone. How quickly he closed his laptop when I entered the room. These weren't new behaviors. I had simply stopped ignoring them. He grew comfortable again as my quiet continued. He joked more. He assumed the balance had returned. He had always thrived on predictability, and I gave it to him willingly. Calm, polite, agreeable. Inside, I was mapping the structure that held his life together. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions that would raise alarms. I gathered context instead. Patterns, dependencies. I understood now that his certainty depended on more than his own actions. It relied on other people staying aligned, on past events remaining buried, on the assumption that I would never disrupt the narrative. That assumption was his greatest miscalculation. One evening, he mentioned Daniel in passing. Just a throwaway comment. A name slipped into conversation. His eyes flicked toward me. Quick and assessing, I responded with a neutral sound and changed the subject. The tension left his shoulders instantly. He believed I wasn't connecting the dots. He believed I didn't see the shape of the thing underneath the surface. He believed that because I had always allowed him to... That night, as I washed the dishes, I found a document tucked into a drawer I rarely opened. Nothing dramatic, just enough to confirm the direction my thoughts had been taking. Not proof yet, but confirmation. I stood there longer than necessary. The water running. The hum of the house around me. I felt steady. Not vengeful. Not afraid. Certain. Silence had stopped being a shield. It had become a choice. He thought he had humiliated me in public. He thought the laughter in that room had settled the matter, reinforced his authority, reminded me of my place. What he didn't understand was that humiliation strips away illusion. It exposes the fault lines beneath confidence. And once you see where something is fragile, you don't need to rush. You only need to wait. By the end of that week, I knew exactly where his perfect life would break, and I knew he would never see it coming. By the second week, the decision no longer felt abstract. It settled into my body with the certainty of something already in motion. I wasn't imagining outcomes anymore. I was preparing for consequences. The secret I had kept wasn't dramatic on its own. It wasn't scandal or spectacle. It was access. Quiet. Overlooked access that had once been useful and then forgotten. Useful to him. That is, he had assumed it expired with time. That whatever I had handled years ago had lost relevance along with my involvement. He never asked. He never checked. He simply moved on. Confident the past stayed buried because it always had. He underestimated how long paper trails last. How people remember who protected them. How authority doesn't disappear just because someone stops acknowledging it. I hadn't thought of it as power before. I thought of it as responsibility. Something I carried because I was capable. Because I could be trusted to clean up what others left behind. He saw it as support. Not leverage. That distinction had worked in his favor for a very long time. Until it didn't. The more I traced the outline of his life, the clearer the structure became. His reputation sat at the center, carefully polished and fiercely defended. Around it were layers of trust, assumptions, and selective memory. Certain people believed in him because they needed him to be credible. Certain institutions relied on his stability because it made things easier. Remove the image, and the rest would scramble to protect itself. I realized then that pushing from the outside would never work. The collapse had to come from within the structure itself. My first move was almost invisible. I changed nothing publicly. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse or threaten. I adjusted access, timing, who received what, and when. It was the kind of change only someone familiar with the inner workings would notice. He didn't, at least not at first. He came home one evening irritated, complaining about delays, about people suddenly asking questions that had never come up before. He framed it as incompetence. I listened, nodded, offered nothing more. Probably just bureaucracy, he said, pouring himself a drink. These things resolve themselves, I agreed. Inside, I felt the quiet confirmation that comes when a theory proves correct. The structure was reacting, not dramatically, just enough to show strain. For a moment, I wondered if I should stop. There was a clean exit available. I could step back, let the tension fade, return to the role I knew so well. No one would question it. He would never know how close he had come to losing everything he valued. That thought lasted exactly as long as it took me to remember the sound of polite laughter. I wasn't creating harm. I wasn't inventing a narrative. I was removing protection. The difference mattered. One was cruelty. The other was truth. The next step required a choice I had avoided making for years. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Not to expose anything. Not to accuse. Just to reconnect. To reopen a line that had gone quiet by design. Not necessity. The response came faster than I expected. It was cautious but open. Familiar but guarded. The kind of tone people use when they sense risk but recognize authority. I read it twice, then closed my laptop and went about my day. That night, my husband watched me more closely than usual. He asked if everything was all right. His voice was gentle, almost concerned. He was trying to locate the shift. "I'm fine," I said, and he believed my calm meant resolution. He had always relied on my emotional labor to stabilize his world. What he didn't understand was that I had stopped providing it. A few days later, something small but telling happened. A meeting he had counted on was postponed. A conversation he expected to control became unexpectedly formal. He shrugged it off in front of me, but his shoulders stayed tense longer than usual. "Strange timing," he muttered. Timing was everything. Late one evening, as he slept, I sat alone at the kitchen table and laid everything out in my mind. Not as revenge, not as punishment, as reality. If his life depended on silence, alignment, and my continued participation, then it was never as strong as it appeared. The moral line I had worried about became clear. I wasn't destroying anything. I was stepping away and letting the truth stand on its own weight. If it collapsed under that weight, it wasn't my doing. It was its design. I gathered the final piece quietly. A document. A confirmation. Something that ensured the next phase wouldn't rely on coincidence or hope. When I closed the folder, my hands were steady. The man sleeping down the hall believed the danger had passed. He thought the laughter in that room had reaffirmed his authority, that my silence had sealed the narrative once again. What he didn't realize was that this was the moment his perfect life became vulnerable. Not because I raised my voice, but because I stopped holding everything together. It began with small fractures, the kind most people dismiss until they realize the structure is already compromised. My husband didn't panic at first. He adjusted. He always believed control was a matter of posture and tone. But something in him had shifted. He checked his phone more often now, even when no notifications came through. He reread emails he used to skim. At night, he lay awake longer than usual, his breathing uneven, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When he spoke, his confidence sounded practiced, like a speech repeated too many times in front of a mirror. I stayed the same. Calm, predictable, pleasant. That unsettled him more than confrontation ever would have. He began correcting me again, sharper this time. Not openly cruel, just enough to reassert hierarchy. Comments about efficiency, about understanding pressure, about how some people simply weren't built to handle complexity. He framed it as stress, as responsibility, as the burden of leadership. I didn't push back. I didn't apologize either. I listened. In public, he doubled down on charm. He laughed louder. He told stories that reinforced his authority. People nodded along. But I noticed the hesitation now. A pause before agreement. A glance exchanged across the room. Tiny things. Almost invisible. Unless you were looking for them. Someone who used to return his calls immediately waited a day. A meeting that once felt guaranteed was suddenly tentative. Nothing dramatic. Nothing he could point to and name. But enough to irritate him. One afternoon, I overheard his name mentioned in a context that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. It wasn't accusation. It was caution. That alone was enough. The shift reached into his inner circle next. At a family dinner, a relative questioned him about a decision he had made. The tone was casual, but the implication wasn't. He bristled, corrected them quickly, smiled as if to dismiss the moment. But I saw the flash of something behind his eyes. Fear, quickly masked by irritation. This had never happened before. For years. His authority had gone unchallenged in those spaces. I had reinforced it myself, redirecting conversations, smoothing disagreements, making sure unity was preserved. This time, I stayed quiet. I let the discomfort linger. Afterward, in the car, he was unusually silent. People get strange when they don't understand the full picture, he said finally. I nodded, staring out the window. He wanted reassurance. He wanted confirmation that the world still made sense, that the rules still applied, that I was still aligned with him against any uncertainty. I gave him none. That night, he asked me a question he had never asked before. You're not talking to anyone about us, are you? The pause before the word us told me everything. I met his eyes and answered truthfully. No, I didn't elaborate. I didn't soften it. I didn't offer the comfort he was fishing for. He studied my face, searching for something familiar. When he didn't find it, he looked away. From that moment on, I understood that this was no longer strategy. It was inevitability. The structure was responding to pressure the way all fragile systems do. It was redistributing weight, seeking stability, exposing weaknesses. I felt no thrill watching it happen. No sense of triumph. Only responsibility. Once truth begins to surface, it doesn't ask permission to continue. I thought about the years I had spent maintaining balance, absorbing tension so nothing cracked. The cost of that work had been invisible, even to me, now that I had stopped doing it. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. He grew more restless, shorter with people, less patient. He tried to reassert control through decisiveness, but it came off as rigidity. Where he once seemed assured, he now seemed defensive. People noticed. One evening, he mentioned how exhausting everything had become, how ungrateful people were, how no one appreciated the pressure he was under. He waited for me to respond, to soothe, to agree. I didn't. I realized then that he was beginning to see me differently. Not as a partner, not even as a problem to manage, but as a variable, something he could no longer predict. That frightened him more than any accusation could have. As the week closed, I stood in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet of a house that no longer felt like a stage set. I felt grounded, certain whatever came next would not be loud. It would not be messy, but it would be final. He had built his life on the assumption that I would always help hold it up. That assumption was gone, and without it, everything else was already beginning to fall. The evening arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if it were any other obligation on his calendar. He dressed with extra care, adjusting his cufflinks twice, smoothing his jacket as though precision alone could restore the certainty he had been losing all week. He looked at himself in the mirror longer than usual, then turned to me with a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This should clear things up," he said. "People just need context." I nodded and picked up my coat. The venue was formal but restrained. The kind of place where reputation mattered more than truth, and where words carried weight because witnesses remembered them. Faces turned when he entered. Some smiled automatically. Others hesitated. Just a fraction too long. He noticed. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened before he forced them back into place. He believed he was here to stabilize the situation, to reassure, to reset the narrative. I let him believe that. The meeting began the way these things always did. Polite introductions, measured statements. He spoke early, confidently, laying out his position with practiced ease. He sounded like himself again, and I could feel his relief. This was his element. Controlled, structured, predictable. Then the first interruption came. A document was referenced. Not accusatory, just factual, a clarification request. He smiled and answered smoothly, dismissing it as a misunderstanding. The room accepted that, at least for the moment. Then another question followed, and another. Each one was small on its own. Together, they formed a shape he couldn't ignore. He glanced at me once, briefly, as if to confirm I was still there, still aligned. I met his eyes calmly. I offered no reassurance. The second document surfaced quietly, its presence announced without drama. This one contradicted the first explanation. Not overtly, just enough to destabilize it. He frowned, corrected himself, laughed lightly, tried to reframe. The laughter didn't come back this time. I recognized the moment he understood this wasn't coincidence. It was the slight delay before he responded. The tightening of his jaw, the shift from confidence to calculation. When I spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. I clarified a detail he had overlooked, provided context he hadn't offered, confirmed a timeline with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were saying. I didn't accuse him. I didn't explain myself. I stated what was true. The room went very still. He turned toward me slowly, disbelief crossing his face before he masked it. This was the first time I had ever corrected him publicly. Not with anger, with precision. "That's not relevant," he said, trying to regain footing. "It is," I replied, evenly. "It's central." More information followed, no longer tentative. The structure he had relied on to absorb pressure began to fail. People shifted in their seats. Someone asked a question he couldn't deflect. Another followed. The careful alignment he depended on fractured under the weight of consistency. I felt nothing like triumph. What I felt was release. He attempted one final appeal, not to logic, but to familiarity. He spoke about intentions, about misunderstandings, about how these things often looked worse than they were. It didn't work. Perception had turned, and once it does, it rarely reverses. Authority that depends on being unquestioned collapses the moment questions are allowed. When I spoke again, it was only to close the matter. "This ends here," I said, not as a threat, but as a boundary, a statement of fact, a refusal to participate further in the illusion. No one argued. The shift was immediate. Conversations moved away from him. Eyes avoided his. The confidence that had once filled rooms now drained out of him, leaving something smaller and unmistakably human behind. He stood there, suddenly uncertain where to place himself, who to address, which version of himself would still be accepted. I watched him without anger, without satisfaction. I watched a man realize, too late, how much of his life had been held together by someone else's silence. When it was over, there was no dramatic exit, no shouting, no final confrontation. People gathered their things, spoke in low voices, avoided his gaze. The room emptied slowly, deliberately, as if everyone needed distance from what had just been revealed. Outside, the night air was cool and steady. I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. He followed me a moment later, his expression tight. Controlled, unfamiliar. "We need to talk," he said. I looked at him. Really looked at him, and understood that whatever he wanted now came too late. The conversation he was seeking belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. "Not tonight," I said. And for the first time, he didn't argue. As I walked away, I didn't feel like I had ended his life. I had ended a story, one built on careful omissions and my willingness to protect it. What remained would have to stand on its own. Behind me, his perfect life didn't shatter loudly. It unraveled quietly, in full view of the people who once believed in it most. That was enough. The rest would happen without me. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, as if the world had collectively decided to lower its voice. There were no dramatic headlines, no public spectacle beyond what had already happened. Just a steady rearranging of reality, subtle but unmistakable. I didn't seek updates about him, but they found me anyway. Someone mentioned a meeting that had been canceled without explanation. Another spoke carefully about a project that was being reassessed. His name came up less often, and when it did, it carried a different weight. Not admiration, not outrage. Caution. That shift alone told me everything. He tried to reach me the next morning. A text, neutral in tone, asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. Later, a voicemail. His voice was controlled, almost gentle, as if calm might rewind the last 24 hours. I deleted it without listening to the end. For years, I had been the place where his uncertainty went to disappear. I had absorbed it, softened it, turned it into reassurance. Without that outlet, it had nowhere to go. In the days that followed, people I hadn't heard from in a long time began to surface. Some offered awkward apologies, carefully phrased to avoid responsibility. Others framed their messages as concern for me, though it was clear they were also recalibrating their own positions. They wanted to know where I stood now, what version of the story would be safest to align with. I listened. I didn't correct them. One conversation stayed with me longer than the others. A woman I had known socially for years invited me for coffee. She spoke cautiously at first, then more freely, admitting she had noticed things she hadn't wanted to name. Comments, moments, patterns. She said she assumed I had chosen to accept them. I told her I had chosen silence, not acceptance. The difference seemed to surprise her. Family dynamics shifted too. A relative reached out, suggesting that what had happened was unfortunate, complicated, something that might have been handled privately. The implication was clear. I had disrupted a balance they preferred intact. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. That balance had always required my discomfort to function. I no longer felt obligated to maintain it. Internally, the aftermath was less tidy. The absence of tension left space I wasn't used to inhabiting. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, ready to manage a situation that no longer existed. How reflexively I anticipated reactions that were no longer my responsibility. Grief arrived quietly, not for him, but for the marriage I believed I was in. I mourned the version of my life that had seemed stable, the future I had imagined built on compromise and endurance. Letting go of that illusion hurt more than losing the man who had benefited from it. I allowed myself to feel that loss without judgment. He tried again, this time in person. He waited outside the house one evening, his posture familiar, his expression carefully composed. When I opened the door, he looked relieved, as if the sight of me confirmed something he needed to believe. "We need to clear this up," he said. Things got out of hand. I didn't invite him in. He spoke about misunderstandings, about timing, about how situations escalate when people don't communicate. He framed himself as reasonable, wounded, unfairly exposed. It was a version of the story I had heard many times before. I let him finish. "There's nothing to clear up," I said. "You said what you said." I stopped protecting it. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "You didn't have to do it that way," he said finally. I met his eyes and felt no urge to defend myself. "There was no other way," I replied. That was the moment he understood something essential had shifted. Not because of what I had done, but because of what I would no longer do. After that, he stopped trying. Life began to reassemble itself around a different center. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations. I slept more deeply. I noticed how quiet mornings could be when they weren't charged with anticipation. I felt alone. Yes, but not diminished. Strength, I realized, wasn't what I had practiced for years. Endurance had kept me in place. Not free. Clarity was something else entirely. I didn't regret what I had done. I regretted how long it had taken me to see the cost of not doing it. The story people told about him would continue to evolve without my involvement. Some would soften it. Some would sharpen it. That no longer concerned me. The version of the story that mattered most was the one I carried forward. By the end of that week, I understood something with complete certainty. Ending his perfect life hadn't given me a new one. It had given me space. Space to decide who I was without accommodation. Space to build something honest. Even if it was smaller, quieter, less impressive to outsiders. As I stood alone in the living room one evening, the house filled with the ordinary sounds of settling wood and distant traffic, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because the story was no longer about him. The final chapter, I knew, would be about what came next. And this time, I would be the one writing it. Months passed, and the quiet stopped feeling temporary. It settled into my life the way truth does when it finally has room to breathe. I woke up without bracing myself. I moved through my days without anticipating someone else's reaction. The absence of tension wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It was mine. I chose a new place to live. Not because I needed distance from him, but because I needed space that had never known his voice. The rooms were smaller, lighter, easier to keep in order. Nothing in them carried history I hadn't chosen. For the first time in years, my surroundings reflected my inner state instead of contradicting it. People began addressing me differently. Not with pity, not with caution, but with something closer to respect. I noticed it in the way conversations shifted when I spoke, in how my silence no longer invited correction. I was no longer introduced in relation to him. My name stood on its own. That change mattered more than I expected. There were moments when loneliness surfaced, unexpected and sharp. Evenings when I reached for my phone out of habit, then set it down again. I had spent so long orienting myself around another person's gravity that the freedom felt disorienting at first. But loneliness, I learned, was not the same as emptiness. It was simply space adjusting to new boundaries. One afternoon, a message arrived from someone I hadn't anticipated hearing from. Short, unassuming, a quiet acknowledgement of something they wished they'd said earlier. It wasn't an apology meant to repair anything. It was recognition. That small moment carried more healing than the public collapse ever had. Healing, I realized, rarely announces itself. It arrives in ordinary moments, in mornings that feel unhurried, in conversations that don't require strategy. It arrives when your body stops holding tension it no longer needs. I thought often about the night everything changed, about how convinced I had been that humiliation was the worst thing that could happen. I understand now that humiliation was simply the breaking point. What followed was clarity. I didn't end his life. I ended my participation in the story that required me to disappear so it could function. There is a difference between revenge and justice that only becomes clear once you stand on the other side of both. Revenge feeds on anger. Justice restores balance. What I did wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to carry weight that was never meant to be mine. I lost a marriage that existed mostly in theory. I lost a version of the future built on endurance. What I gained was something far more durable. I gained my voice without having to raise it. There are still people who will never understand my choice. Some prefer comfort over truth. Some miss the version of me who made things easier for everyone else. I don't resent them. I simply don't organize my life around their comfort anymore. The most surprising part was how little I needed closure from him. Once I stopped protecting the illusion, it collapsed on its own. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need remorse. I needed separation. That was enough. On a quiet evening, sitting by the window as the light shifted across the floor, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph. Not relief alone. Recognition. I saw myself clearly. Without distortion. Without apology. I hadn't lost my family that night. I lost the illusion, and losing it saved my life. If you've stayed with this story until now, you might recognize pieces of yourself in it. Maybe you've been quiet in rooms where your silence was mistaken for agreement. Maybe you've carried the emotional labor of holding everything together while someone else took credit for the stability. Or maybe you're still standing at the beginning, wondering whether clarity is worth the cost. If this story spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, or simply let me know which moment resonated most. These conversations matter, and you're not alone in them. And if you want to stay here for more stories about dignity, betrayal, and finding strength without losing yourself, consider subscribing and staying with the channel. Sometimes the most powerful journeys aren't loud. They're honest. Thank you for listening.